14 years ago, on a humid August night in Brookhaven, Mississippi, 27-year-old Barbara Collins finished wiping down the last table at Mel's Diner, said goodbye to her coworkers, and walked into the parking lot, where her aging Honda Civic waited under a flickering streetlight. The drive home should have taken 7 minutes, but she never arrived. Police suspected foul play. Barbara wasn't the type to vanish, and even her car disappeared. With no witnesses, no footage, and every lead dissolving like mist over the Pearl River, the case went cold until 2024 DNA technology revealed the predator was her trusted neighbor. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe. The night of August 17, 2010, settled over Brookhaven like a heavy quilt, oppressive, still, with the kind of humid heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin. The cicadas had started their evening chorus, their drone mixing with the distant hum of 18-wheelers on Interstate. Downtown, the neon signs at Mel's Diner and the Chevron station cast pink and blue shadows across empty sidewalks as the small town prepared for sleep. Inside Mel's Diner, Barbara Collins moved with practiced efficiency, her auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail that swayed as she wiped down tables and stacked chairs. At 27, she had the kind of genuine smile that made truckers leave bigger tips and regulars ask about her day. She'd been working the late shift for 3 years, saving money while taking online courses in accounting, always planning, always moving towards something better. Barbara was the heart of that place, recalls her coworker, Jenny Martinez, who worked alongside her that final night. She remembered everyone's order, their kids' names, and their troubles. People came in not just for coffee, but because she made them feel like they mattered. The diner's regulars knew Barbara's routine by heart. She'd finish her shift around 11:30, spend 15 minutes in the back counting tips and updating inventory, then emerge with her purse slung over her shoulder and her keys jingling in her hand. That Tuesday night followed the same pattern, except for one small detail that would haunt Jenny forever. She hugged me in the parking lot. Jenny remembers, her voice still catching after all these years. She said, "See you tomorrow, hon. Drive safe." I never thought those would be the last words I'd hear her say. Barbara climbed into her 2004 Honda Civic, the silver paint dulled by Mississippi sun and countless trips between home and work. The engine turned over with its familiar wheeze, and she pulled out of the gravel parking lot at exactly 11:47 p.m. A detail captured by the diner's basic security system, though the camera's grainy footage would prove frustratingly inadequate. The route home was simple: left on Brookway Boulevard, straight for 2 miles, then right on Magnolia Street to the small duplex she shared with her mother. In normal traffic, the drive took 7 minutes. At midnight on a Tuesday, with empty roads stretching ahead, it should have taken 5. 7 miles away, Evelyn Collins sat on her front porch, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in her hands. At 53, she was a woman of routine. Tea at 11:30, porch light on, waiting for the familiar sound of Barbara's Honda pulling into the driveway. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Midnight, 12:15, 12:30. By 12:45, Evelyn's concern had crystallized into fear, and by 1 a.m., she was pacing the length of the porch, her cell phone pressed to her ear, listening to Barbara's voicemail message over and over again. The last ping from Barbara's cell phone came at 11:52 p.m., 5 minutes after she left the diner, from a tower serving the rural stretch of Highway 51. After that, silence, a digital void that would taunt investigators for years to come. In 2010, GPS tracking was limited, cell tower triangulation was imprecise, and the technology that might have revealed Barbara's final moments simply didn't exist. As dawn broke over Brookhaven on August 18, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that Barbara would never see again, her absence had already begun to tear at the fabric of a community that prided itself on knowing everyone's business. The empty driveway, the cold cup of tea on the porch rail, the phone calls that went straight to voicemail, all signs that something terrible had happened in their quiet corner of Mississippi. By sunrise, Brookhaven would wake to whispers of something dark moving through their midst, and nothing would ever be the same again. Morning fog rolled across Brookhaven like cigarette smoke, clinging to the kudzu-covered telephone poles and settling in the low places where the Pearl River carved its lazy path through Lincoln County. The air hung thick and sweet with the scent of magnolia blossoms, but inside the small duplex on Magnolia Street, Evelyn Collins couldn't smell anything except her own fear. She had spent the night moving between the front porch and Barbara's empty bedroom, checking the driveway every few minutes, as if her daughter's Honda might materialize out of thin air. By 6 a.m., when the church bells at First Baptist began their morning call to worship, Evelyn knew with bone-deep certainty that something terrible had happened. The first phone call went to Barbara's best friend, Lisa Hampton, who lived 3 blocks away in a shotgun house painted the color of butter. Lisa's voice, thick with sleep and confusion, would replay in Evelyn's mind for years afterward. What do you mean she didn't come home? Maybe she went to Jackson for something. Maybe her car broke down. But Evelyn knew her daughter. Barbara called when she was going to be late. Barbara never spent the night anywhere without warning. Barbara answered her phone, always, even when she was annoyed or tired or busy. By 8 a.m., Evelyn was standing in the lobby of the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office, her hands shaking as she filled out a missing person report. Deputy Marcus Webb, a soft-spoken man in his 40s, who had grown up 3 streets over from the Collins family, listened with growing concern as Evelyn described her daughter's routine, her reliability and her complete inability to simply vanish. "Mrs. Collins," Deputy Webb said gently, "I know this is scary, but most missing person cases—" "Not Barbara," Evelyn interrupted, her voice sharp with certainty. "I checked the driveway a dozen times last night, praying maybe she'd pulled in and I'd missed it somehow. But her bed wasn't slept in. Her coffee cup is still in the sink from yesterday morning. Something happened to my baby." Within an hour, Sheriff James Patterson had mobilized every available deputy to canvass Barbara's route home. They drove the 7-mile stretch between Mel's Diner and Magnolia Street 3 times, stopping at every intersection, checking every ditch, and questioning the handful of people who might have been awake at midnight on a Tuesday. The Chevron station attendant remembered seeing a silver Honda around the right time, but the security cameras only covered the pumps, not the road. The initial search revealed disturbing gaps in what should have been a simple investigation. In 2010, Brookhaven was still catching up to the digital age. Traffic cameras were sparse. Businesses relied on outdated security systems, and cell phone tracking required warrants that took precious hours to obtain. By the time investigators pinged Barbara's phone location, the trail had gone cold at a cell tower serving a 10-square-mile area of rural farmland and dense pine forest. As word spread through Brookhaven's network of churches, schools, and coffee shops, volunteers began appearing at the sheriff's office. Teachers from the elementary school where Barbara had once worked as a substitute, customers from the diner who remembered her kindness, neighbors who barely knew her but understood that when someone disappeared in a town of 12,000 people, everyone was affected. Martha Hendricks, who lived next door to the Collins family, brought over a casserole and stayed to answer phones. "I kept thinking about my own daughter," she remembers. "How she drives home late from her job in Jackson sometimes. It could have been any of our girls." By evening, the search had expanded to include the volunteer fire department's boats, which began dragging the deeper sections of the Pearl River. The Civil Air Patrol was contacted about aerial reconnaissance. Flyers with Barbara's photograph, a radiant smile, hazel eyes, wearing the blue Mel's Diner uniform, were posted on every telephone pole, storefront window, and church bulletin board in 3 counties. That first night, as darkness settled over Brookhaven once again, more than 50 people gathered in the Collins front yard for an impromptu candlelight vigil. They stood in a rough circle on the patchy grass, holding flickering flames against the encroaching dark, while Evelyn Collins spoke about her daughter in the present tense, because to speak of Barbara in the past would be to surrender hope, and hope was all she had left. "She's out there somewhere," Evelyn told the assembled crowd, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "She's waiting for us to find her, and we're going to keep looking until we bring her home." By nightfall, Brookhaven was no longer whispering about Barbara Collins' disappearance. They were searching with desperate intensity, united by the terrible knowledge that one of their own had vanished into the humid Mississippi darkness, leaving behind only questions and an empty driveway that seemed to grow larger with each passing hour. The August sun rose merciless and bright over Lincoln County, on the third day after Barbara Collins vanished, turning the search into a test of endurance against the Mississippi heat. Along Highway 51, where the asphalt shimmered like water and the air smelled of hot tar and pine sap, search parties formed a human chain stretching across ditches thick with kudzu and blackberry brambles. Sheriff Patterson had called in favors from 3 neighboring counties, bringing the total number of law enforcement officers to nearly 30. The Mississippi Highway Patrol sent a helicopter that carved lazy circles over the dense forest between Brookhaven and the Pearl River, its rotors beating a rhythm that could be heard for miles. On the ground, teams of volunteers moved methodically through the underbrush, calling Barbara's name until their voices grew hoarse. "We covered every square inch within a 20-mile radius," recalls Deputy Webb, who coordinated the ground search. "Every abandoned building, every hunting camp, every stretch of riverbank where someone might dump a car. The dogs hit on scent trails twice, but both led to dead ends, literally just places where Barbara had walked or driven in the past. The bloodhounds, borrowed from the state prison system, worked in shifts to avoid exhaustion in the brutal heat. They followed Barbara's scent from the diner parking lot to the intersection of Highway 51 and County Road 24, then lost it completely, as if she had simply evaporated into the thick air." The canine handlers exchanged puzzled looks, running the dogs over the same stretch of asphalt again and again, but the trail remained cold. Meanwhile, investigators were building a timeline of Barbara's final hours with forensic precision. Security footage from 3 businesses along her route provided partial views of traffic, but the grainy black and white images revealed little more than shadows and headlights. The technology that would later revolutionize criminal investigation, high-definition cameras, facial recognition software, and comprehensive traffic monitoring, might have solved the case in hours, but in 2010, detectives were working with tools that belonged to an earlier era. "Every missing hour makes recovery harder," Sheriff Patterson told the growing crowd of media representatives who had descended on Brookhaven. "But we're not giving up. This is our community, our people. We'll search until we find answers." The investigation took on an almost military organization. Command posts were established at the sheriff's office and the volunteer fire department. Maps covered every available wall, marked with colored pins representing search areas, witness locations, and potential evidence. Phone banks staffed by volunteers logged hundreds of tips, each one carefully recorded and assigned to detectives for follow-up. The most promising lead came from a truck driver named Dale Morrison, who remembered seeing a silver Honda Civic pulled over on the shoulder of Highway 51 around midnight on August 6. But when investigators pressed for details, Morrison's account grew fuzzy. He'd been driving for 14 hours straight, fighting to stay awake, and couldn't be certain about the time, the exact location, or whether anyone was with the vehicle. Forensic investigators combed through the diner parking lot, where Barbara had last been seen, collecting fiber samples from the gravel, taking impressions of tire tracks, and dusting her assigned parking space for fingerprints. The evidence bags filled slowly, cigarette butts that could have belonged to anyone, a few strands of hair that might or might not be Barbara's, and fibers from clothing that appeared ordinary and untraceable. In 2010, DNA analysis was expensive and time-consuming, reserved for cases with clear suspects and obvious biological evidence. Touch DNA, the microscopic skin cells left behind by simple contact, was still an emerging science, and many smaller police departments lacked the resources to pursue such advanced testing. The fiber samples from Mel's Diner were cataloged and stored, waiting for technology and budgets to catch up with investigative need. As the first week stretched into the second, the search evolved from frantic urgency to grim determination. The helicopter flights became less frequent, the volunteer search parties grew smaller as people returned to jobs and responsibilities. But a core group of family and friends maintained their vigil, organizing themselves into shifts that kept someone looking for Barbara around the clock. Evelyn Collins became the public face of the search, appearing on local television stations and granting interviews to newspaper reporters from Jackson and New Orleans. She spoke about Barbara's dreams, her kindness, and her plans for the future, always in the present tense, always with the unshakable conviction that her daughter was alive and waiting to be found. She wanted to finish school and maybe open her own restaurant someday. Evelyn told Channel 12 News, standing in her front yard, with Barbara's photograph clutched against her chest. She used to practice recipes on me and my neighbors, always trying to make something special. She's got too much life in her to just be gone. The candlelight vigils continued every evening, though the crowds grew smaller as the weeks passed. But those who remained formed an unbreakable bond, united by their refusal to let Barbara Collins become just another missing person statistic. They held their candles high against the Mississippi darkness, their flames flickering like prayers carried on the humid night air. Soon, however, the leads would thin to nothing, and the investigation would face the most frustrating enemy of all, time, which erodes evidence, dulls memories, and transforms urgent searches into cold cases, filed away in cardboard boxes. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright over Brookhaven, the kind of day that should have brought peace to the soul but instead highlighted every shadow where evil might hide. The bells of First Baptist Church rang out across the town square, calling the faithful to worship, but even in the sanctuary, prayers included Barbara Collins' name. Pastor Michael Roberts, who had baptized Barbara when she was 12, struggled to find words of comfort for a congregation grappling with the unthinkable. "Lord, we don't understand why darkness has touched our community," he prayed from the pulpit, his voice echoing off stained glass windows that cast colored light across bowed heads. "But we trust in your plan, and we ask you to bring Barbara home safely to those who love her." In the pews, neighbors who had lived peacefully alongside each other for decades now studied faces with new suspicion. The comfortable assumption that Brookhaven was immune to serious crime had been shattered, replaced by a paranoid awareness that evil could be hiding behind any familiar smile. "We thought Brookhaven was safe," admits Joyce Patterson, who lived 3 blocks from the Collins family and had known Barbara since she was a little girl riding her bicycle to the corner store. "We didn't lock our doors, let our kids walk to school alone, and never worried about working late shifts. If this could happen to Barbara, sweet, careful Barbara, it could happen to anyone." The rumor mill, that invisible network that connects every small southern town, worked overtime processing theories about Barbara's disappearance. At Mel's Diner, now partially empty without Barbara's bright presence, customers spoke in hushed tones about drifters, truck drivers, and maybe even someone local with a dark secret. Every stranger who had passed through town in the past month became a potential suspect. Every argument Barbara might have had, however minor, was dissected for clues. The most persistent rumors centered on a vagrant who had been seen around town in the weeks before Barbara's disappearance. Local business owners remembered a thin man with greasy hair and worn clothes, asking for work or spare change. He'd been spotted near the Walmart, outside the library, and even in the diner's parking lot, but when investigators tracked him down 2 counties over, his alibi was rock solid. He'd been in the Hinds County Jail on a public intoxication charge since August. Another lead emerged from the truck stop on Interstate 55, where a waitress named Donna Mills reported serving a nervous, agitated customer around 2 a.m. on August 18. The man had ordered coffee and pie but barely touched either, constantly checking his watch and looking toward the parking lot. Donna remembered thinking he seemed scared or guilty of something, but when she described him to police sketch artists, the resulting composite could have matched half the men in Mississippi. "He had that look," Donna told investigators, "like he'd done something terrible and couldn't stop thinking about it. But then again, maybe I'm just seeing things that weren't there because of what happened to that poor girl." The investigation expanded to include a detailed examination of Barbara's personal life, searching for enemies, secret relationships, or hidden troubles that might explain her disappearance. Detectives interviewed every coworker, every regular customer at the diner, and every classmate from her online accounting courses. They combed through her cell phone records, her bank statements, and her social media accounts, looking for any thread that might unravel the mystery. What they found was a life of almost boring normalcy. Barbara paid her bills on time, saved money methodically, and maintained friendly but not intimate relationships with most people she knew. She had dated occasionally but wasn't seeing anyone seriously. Her biggest vice was an addiction to reality television shows, which she watched with her mother while eating ice cream straight from the container. She was just a regular person living a regular life, reflects Detective Sarah Montgomery, who joined the investigation in its second week. No drugs, no debts, no drama. The kind of victim who makes a case harder to solve because there's no obvious motive, no clear suspect, and no smoking gun. The lack of traditional clues forced investigators to cast a wider net, interviewing anyone who might have seen Barbara on her final night. The process was tedious and often heartbreaking, family members breaking down as they described their last conversations with Barbara, coworkers struggling to remember seemingly insignificant details that might hold the key to everything. At the Chevron station where Barbara sometimes stopped for gas, security cameras had captured partial images of vehicles passing by around midnight, but the footage was too grainy to identify makes, models, or license plates. The station attendant, a teenager named Kevin Walsh, remembered the silver Honda but couldn't say whether Barbara had seemed distressed or if anyone else had been with her. "I see hundreds of cars every night," Kevin explained apologetically. "I wish I could remember more, but she just seemed normal, you know? Just getting gas and going home like everybody else." As the investigation entered its third week, the initial surge of community support began to show signs of strain. The volunteer search parties grew smaller, the tips called into the sheriff's office became more speculative and less credible, and the media attention started to fade as other stories claimed headlines. But for Barbara's family and closest friends, the passage of time only intensified their desperation. Evelyn Collins organized a reward fund, pooling donations from local businesses and church congregations, until the total reached $15,000, a significant sum for a working-class community, representing genuine sacrifice from people who had little to spare. Flyers advertising the reward were distributed throughout Mississippi and neighboring states, with Barbara's face staring out from telephone poles and store windows like a silent plea for justice. The posters began to fade under the harsh Mississippi sun, their edges curling and colors bleeding, but the determination of those who loved Barbara Collins remained as strong as ever, sustained by the terrible knowledge that somewhere in their peaceful community, a predator walked free. By September 2010, the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office looked like a war room preparing for a battle that couldn't be won. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins that represented searches conducted, witnesses interviewed, and leads that had evaporated like morning dew. Red string connected various locations and persons of interest, creating a web that seemed to grow more complex and confusing with each passing day. Detective Sarah Montgomery sat at her desk at 3 a.m., surrounded by case files that had multiplied like kudzu, spreading across every surface until there was barely room for her coffee cup. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed with electrical persistence, casting harsh shadows across crime scene photographs and witness statements that had been read and reread until the words seemed to blur together into meaningless patterns. "We had interviewed over 200 people by that point," Montgomery recalls, her voice carrying the weight of exhaustion that comes from chasing ghosts. "Everyone who knew Barbara, everyone who might have seen her that night, everyone who had any connection to the diner or her route home. We'd polygraphed the obvious suspects, ex-boyfriends, co-workers with grudges, anyone with a criminal history in the area. They all passed, or their alibis checked out perfectly." The case files told a story of systematic frustration. Every promising lead had dissolved under scrutiny. The vagrant who had been spotted near the diner was eliminated through jail records. The nervous truck stop customer had been identified as a traveling salesman whose credit card receipts placed him 2 states away during the critical time window. The silver Honda seen by various witnesses belonged to 4 different people, none of whom had any connection to Barbara Collins. Sheriff Patterson found himself juggling resources between the Collins investigation and the routine criminal activity that never paused for major cases. Domestic violence calls, drug arrests, and property crimes continued to demand attention from his small department, but the community expected constant progress on Barbara's disappearance. The pressure was mounting from every direction. Family members who called daily for updates, media representatives who sensed the story was growing cold, and his own conscience that wouldn't let him abandon a case that had consumed his department for weeks. The physical evidence, what little there was, had been processed and reprocessed without yielding significant results. Fibers collected from the diner parking lot were sent to the state crime lab in Jackson, where overworked technicians confirmed that they were consistent with common clothing materials, cotton, polyester, and denim, that could have come from any of thousands of garments worn by any of hundreds of people who frequented the area. In 2010, DNA analysis was still expensive and time-consuming, typically reserved for cases with clear biological evidence and obvious suspects. The skin cells and microscopic traces that would later revolutionize criminal investigation were barely detectable with existing technology, and many smaller police departments lacked the budget to pursue such advanced testing. Touch DNA was an emerging science that required specialized equipment and expertise that simply wasn't available in rural Mississippi. "We collected everything we could find," explains crime scene technician Robert Hayes, who had processed the diner parking lot with painstaking care. "But most of what we gathered was essentially background noise, trace evidence, that could have been deposited by anyone over days or weeks. We needed something definitive, something that could only have come from the perpetrator, and we just didn't have it." The investigation took on an almost desperate quality as detectives pursued increasingly unlikely scenarios. They examined Barbara's online activity, searching for evidence of internet stalkers or dangerous relationships conducted in digital spaces. They interviewed distant relatives, former neighbors, and anyone who might harbor a grudge or obsession that could explain her disappearance. They even considered the possibility that Barbara had staged her own disappearance, though this theory was quickly abandoned. Her bank accounts remained untouched, her personal belongings were left behind, and everyone who knew her testified to her deep attachment to her mother and her community. The most frustrating aspect of the investigation was the complete absence of Barbara's Honda Civic. In most missing person cases, the victim's vehicle provides crucial evidence: blood, fingerprints, signs of struggle, or at least a location that narrows the search area. But Barbara's car had vanished as completely as she had, as if both had been swallowed by the Mississippi earth itself. "We checked every junkyard, every chop shop, every isolated farm where someone might hide a vehicle," says Deputy Webb, who coordinated the search for the Honda. "We ran the VIN through every database available, contacted law enforcement agencies in surrounding states, and even checked with insurance companies in case someone tried to report it stolen. Nothing. It was like that car had never existed." The case began to consume the investigators assigned to it. Becoming more than a professional obligation, it was a personal mission that followed them home at night and invaded their dreams with unanswered questions. Detective Montgomery found herself driving Barbara's route home obsessively, stopping at every intersection, studying every ditch and wooded area where a crime might have been committed or evidence might be hidden. As autumn arrived in Mississippi, painting the countryside in shades of gold and crimson, the Barbara Collins investigation settled into a grim routine of following up on increasingly unlikely tips and revisiting evidence that had already been thoroughly examined. The case files grew thicker, but the answers remained as elusive as shadows dancing at the edge of vision. "I think we all knew it was becoming a cold case," admits Sheriff Patterson, reflecting on that difficult period. "Not because we were giving up, but because we'd exhausted every conventional investigative technique available to us. We needed a miracle, or new technology, or someone to come forward with information they'd been hiding. Without one of those breaks, we were just spinning our wheels." By the second anniversary of Barbara's disappearance, the active investigation had been scaled back to periodic evidence reviews and the occasional follow-up on tips that continued to trickle in. The case files were transferred to storage boxes, where they would wait for years in climate-controlled silence, holding their secrets like buried treasure waiting for the right key to unlock their mysteries. The seasons turned with relentless indifference, each changing leaf and falling snowflake, marking another day that Barbara Collins remained missing. By 2012, the anniversary vigils had grown smaller, the media attention had faded to occasional follow-up stories, and the investigation had settled into the uncomfortable limbo that defines cold cases, not closed, not forgotten, but suspended in a state of frustrated inactivity. Evelyn Collins, aged years in the space of months, her brown hair showing streaks of premature silver and her face bearing lines that hadn't been there before her daughter's disappearance. But every evening, without exception, she performed the same ritual that had become her anchor in a world suddenly devoid of certainty. She turned on the porch light, that single beacon cutting through the Mississippi darkness like a prayer made visible. If she can't find her way home, Evelyn would tell anyone who asked about the light, "I'll keep it burning so she knows we're waiting. I'll keep it on until she walks through that front door and tells me where she's been all this time." The electric bill for keeping that light burning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, cost Evelyn an extra $40 each month, money she could barely afford on her salary as a school cafeteria worker. But she paid it without complaint, viewing it as an investment in hope, a tangible reminder that giving up was not an option. The duplex on Magnolia Street became a shrine to Barbara's memory and a monument to maternal determination. Barbara's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it, clothes hanging in the closet, textbooks stacked on the desk, and a half-finished crossword puzzle still lying on the nightstand with a pencil beside it. Evelyn dusted the room weekly, changed the sheets monthly, and sometimes sat on the bed reading aloud from Barbara's favorite romance novels, as if her voice might somehow reach across the void that separated them. Every month on the 17th, the date Barbara had disappeared, Evelyn drove her daughter's route home from the diner, stopping at significant locations to leave fresh flowers. The intersection of Highway 51 and County Road 24, where the bloodhounds had lost Barbara's scent, became a regular pilgrimage site, marked by artificial roses that Evelyn replaced as they faded in the Mississippi sun. "I know people think I'm crazy," she admitted to her sister during one of their weekly phone calls. "I see them watching me, talking behind their hands about poor Evelyn, who can't accept reality, but they don't understand. A mother knows. Somewhere in my heart, I can still feel her. She's not gone, not really gone. She's just lost, and it's my job to help her find her way back." The financial strain of Barbara's disappearance extended beyond electric bills for porch lights. Evelyn had taken unpaid leave from her job during the intensive search period, and the lost wages created a debt that took months to repay. She sold Barbara's car, a decision that broke her heart but provided necessary income, and moved to a smaller apartment to reduce expenses. But she refused offers from well-meaning friends and relatives to help her move on or accept what happened. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her grief. Friends who had initially rallied around her with casseroles and company gradually returned to their own lives, leaving Evelyn to navigate her loss alone. Conversations became awkward, filled with careful silences around topics that might remind her of Barbara, which meant almost everything, since a mother's world revolves around her child in ways that childless people cannot fully comprehend. Barbara's father, who had divorced Evelyn when Barbara was 15, dealt with his grief differently. He remarried, moved to Florida, and rarely spoke about his missing daughter. When he did call Evelyn, usually on Barbara's birthday or Christmas, their conversations were stilted and painful, filled with the weight of shared loss and divergent coping mechanisms. He wanted to have a memorial service, Evelyn remembers, her voice tight with old anger. Said it would give us closure. But you don't bury someone who might still be alive. You don't give up when there's still hope. That's the difference between a father who visits on weekends and a mother who raised her baby every single day. The psychological toll was evident to anyone who knew Evelyn well. She developed insomnia, often pacing the house at night, or sitting on the porch watching empty streets as if Barbara might emerge from the shadows. She lost weight, forgot to eat meals, and seemed to exist in a perpetual state of waiting that drained her energy like a slow leak in a tire. Yet she also found unexpected strength in her commitment to keeping Barbara's memory alive. She organized annual scholarship fundraisers at the local high school, established a missing persons support group that met monthly at the library, and maintained a Facebook page dedicated to Barbara's case that attracted followers from across the country. The page became a digital vigil, with strangers posting prayers and encouragement from as far away as California and Maine. "Your daughter sounds like she was a wonderful person." One typical message read, "I'm praying for her safe return and for strength for your family. Don't give up hope. Miracles happen every day." The support from strangers provided comfort that local friends couldn't offer, perhaps because people who had never known Barbara could focus purely on hope without being burdened by the growing statistical likelihood that she was dead. Online, Evelyn could exist in a community of people who understood that love doesn't end with death, and hope doesn't expire with the passage of time. As 2013 became 2014, and 2014 became 2015, the porch light continued to burn through Mississippi nights that grew longer and lonelier with each passing year. Neighbors grew accustomed to its presence, children in the neighborhood learned to expect it, and new residents accepted it as simply part of the landscape, not knowing the story behind the beacon that refused to surrender to darkness. But somewhere in a climate-controlled storage facility, evidence boxes labeled Collins, Barbara missing person, waited patiently for technology and time to converge in ways that would finally illuminate the truth that had hidden in microscopic traces for so many years. The porch light would not burn in vain, though its use would ultimately be revealed in ways that Evelyn Collins could never have imagined during those long, lonely nights of waiting. By 2020, Barbara Collins had been missing for a decade, and Brookhaven had learned to carry her absence like a scar that had healed over but never quite stopped aching. The town had grown during the intervening years. New subdivisions sprawled beyond the old city limits, chain restaurants had opened along the interstate, and young families had moved in from Jackson seeking small-town safety and affordable housing. But for longtime residents, Barbara's disappearance remained a defining moment that had changed how they saw their community and themselves. The annual vigils continued, though they had evolved from desperate prayers for Barbara's safe return into something more complex. Part memorial, part community ritual, part stubborn refusal to let evil triumph through forgetfulness. Each August 17th, a core group of 20 or 30 people gathered in the Collins' old front yard, now owned by a young couple who had moved from California and knew nothing of the property's history until their first summer in Mississippi. "Sometimes I still set an extra plate at Christmas," admits Jenny Martinez, Barbara's former co-worker who had never quite recovered from being the last person to speak with her. "It's been 10 years, and logically I know she's not coming to dinner. But emotionally there's this part of me that can't accept she's really gone. So I set the plate, and I tell my kids, it's for someone who might need a place at our table." The psychological impact of an unsolved disappearance ripples through a community in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Parents became more protective, insisting on curfews and check-ins that previous generations had considered unnecessary. Women working late shifts arranged for escorts to their cars or carpooled for safety. The comfortable assumption that Brookhaven was immune to serious crime had been permanently shattered, replaced by an awareness that evil could be hiding behind any familiar face. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a psychologist who had moved to Brookhaven in 2018, noticed patterns in her practice that she eventually traced back to Barbara's disappearance. Clients spoke about feeling watched, about checking locks multiple times before bed, and about the persistent anxiety that comes from knowing that someone in their community had committed a terrible crime and never been caught. Unresolved trauma becomes community trauma, Dr. Walsh explains. When someone disappears without explanation, it creates a hole in the collective psyche that gets filled with fear and suspicion. People start looking at their neighbors differently, wondering who might be capable of violence. The social trust that holds small communities together begins to erode. The erosion was subtle but measurable. Local businesses reported that fewer women worked evening shifts alone. Parents organized more elaborate pickup and drop-off systems for teenagers with after-school jobs. The tradition of leaving doors unlocked during the day quietly disappeared, replaced by deadbolts and security systems that previous generations would have considered paranoid. Yet the community also found ways to honor Barbara's memory that brought people together rather than driving them apart. The Barbara Collins Memorial Scholarship provided funding for young women pursuing higher education, particularly those studying accounting or business, the fields Barbara had hoped to enter. Local high school students participated in an annual 5K run that raised money for missing persons organizations throughout Mississippi. Mel's Diner, where Barbara had worked her final shift, became an unofficial memorial site. Her photograph hung near the cash register, and longtime customers still referred to her usual tables as Barbara's section. New employees learned her story as part of their training, creating a bridge between past and present that kept her memory alive for people who had never met her. "She's like a guardian angel for this place," says current manager Rosa Delgado, who started working at the diner 5 years after Barbara's disappearance. "When we're having a bad day, or a difficult customer gives us trouble, someone will say, 'Barbara's watching over us,' and it makes everything a little easier to handle." The investigation itself had settled into a holding pattern by 2020, with Detective Montgomery reviewing the case files annually and following up on occasional tips that continued to trickle in. The original investigators had retired or moved to other departments, taking with them the intimate knowledge of every witness statement and every piece of evidence that had been collected during the initial intensive search. Sheriff Patterson, now in his second decade of dealing with the Collins case, had developed a routine of visiting Evelyn Collins every few months to assure her that Barbara had not been forgotten. These visits were both a professional obligation and a personal mission. Patterson had children of his own, and he understood that a parent's grief doesn't follow the same timeline as police investigations. "We still get tips," he would tell Evelyn during these visits, sitting in her small living room surrounded by photographs of Barbara at every age from toddler to young woman. "People call when they see something suspicious or when they remember a detail they didn't think was important at the time. We follow up on every single one, because you never know which call might be the one that breaks the case open." The tips came from across the country: truckers who thought they had seen Barbara at rest stops in Tennessee, social workers who believed they recognized her among homeless populations in New Orleans, and well-meaning psychics who claimed to have visions of her location. Each tip required investigation, each lead had to be pursued with the same thoroughness as more promising evidence, and each dead end added another layer of frustration to a case that seemed designed to resist solution. But in 2022, something changed in the cold case universe that would eventually reach even the quiet evidence rooms of Lincoln County. New DNA technologies, advanced computer databases, and federal grants for processing old evidence had begun to revolutionize how police departments approached unsolved crimes. The same microscopic traces that had been meaningless in 2010 could now be analyzed with precision that bordered on magic. Sheriff Patterson, now eyeing retirement but unwilling to leave the Collins case unsolved, applied for a federal grant that would fund the re-examination of old evidence using modern techniques. The application process was lengthy and bureaucratic, but Patterson was motivated by more than professional duty. He was driven by the memory of a mother who had kept a porch light burning for 12 years, refusing to surrender hope even when logic suggested that hope was futile. The grant was approved in late 2022, and evidence boxes that had been gathering dust in climate-controlled storage were suddenly precious cargo, being transported to the state's most advanced forensic laboratory. Fibers that had been collected and cataloged in 2010 were about to be examined by machines that could detect DNA signatures from skin cells invisible to previous technology. The porch light that had burned through more than 4,000 Mississippi nights was about to serve its purpose in ways that Evelyn Collins had never imagined, illuminating not just the darkness outside her home, but the microscopic evidence that would finally reveal who had stolen her daughter from that August night so many years ago. As 2023 dawned over Brookhaven, the Collins case was about to transform from a cold file gathering dust into an active investigation that would shake the community to its foundations and prove that some lights are too strong to be extinguished by time, distance, or even death itself. The Mississippi State Crime Laboratory in Jackson hummed with quiet efficiency on a cold January morning in 2023, its sterile corridors and temperature-controlled rooms representing the cutting edge of forensic science. Amanda Chen, the lab's newest DNA analyst, had arrived early to begin work on a batch of cold case evidence that had been submitted under a federal grant program designed to bring closure to families who had waited years for answers. The fluorescent lights overhead cast an even glow across Dr. Chen's workstation, where evidence bags from the Barbara Collins case lay arranged in careful sequence. Each bag was labeled with case numbers, collection dates, and chain of custody information that read like archaeological records from an earlier era of criminal investigation. The fibers that had been collected from Mel's Diner parking lot 13 years earlier looked unremarkable, tiny strands of cotton and polyester that could have come from any piece of clothing worn by any of hundreds of people. The technology we have now would have seemed like science fiction in 2010, Dr. Chen explains, adjusting the settings on a machine that cost more than most people's houses. We can extract DNA profiles from skin cells that are invisible to the naked eye, cells that were deposited by simple contact touching a doorknob, brushing against someone's clothing, or even just standing close enough for microscopic skin flakes to transfer. The process of analyzing touch DNA requires patience and precision that borders on meditation. Each fiber had to be examined under high-powered magnification, treated with chemical solutions that would release any genetic material present, then subjected to amplification techniques that could take microscopic quantities of DNA and multiply them until there was enough material to create a viable profile. Dr. Chen worked methodically through the evidence bags, starting with items that seemed most likely to yield results. A fiber that had been caught on a rough edge of the diner's dumpster showed promise. It appeared to have been torn from someone's clothing during a struggle or hasty movement. Under magnification, the fiber revealed what looked like skin cells embedded in its weave, microscopic evidence of human contact that previous technology had been unable to detect. The amplification process took 18 hours, during which Dr. Chen monitored computer screens that displayed the gradual construction of a genetic profile from scattered molecular fragments. The work was tedious but fascinating, watching modern science tease information from evidence that had been silent for more than a decade. It's like archaeology, she reflects, except instead of digging up pottery shards and arrowheads, we're excavating DNA signatures from trace evidence that was collected years ago. Every cold case has the potential to become an active investigation again, because the evidence never stops existing. We just needed better tools to read it. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon, when Dr. Chen's computer screen displayed a DNA profile that was complete enough for database comparison. The genetic signature showed markers consistent with male DNA, distinct from any of the known samples that had been collected from Barbara Collins, her family members, or the diner employees who had been eliminated as suspects during the original investigation. The next step was running the profile through CODIS, the combined DNA index system that contains genetic profiles from convicted criminals, arrestees, and unsolved crimes across the United States. The search function that had been primitive in 2010 had evolved into a sophisticated system capable of identifying matches from among millions of stored profiles in a matter of minutes. Dr. Chen submitted the unknown profile to CODIS at 3:47 p.m. on January 26, 2023, and settled back to wait for results that could take anywhere from hours to days depending on system traffic. She had processed enough cold cases to know that most searches ended in disappointment. The vast majority of unknown DNA profiles never matched anything in the database, leaving investigators with genetic evidence but no suspect to connect it to. But sometimes, science and justice converge in moments that feel like miracles. The CODIS hit came back in less than 2 hours, displaying information that made Dr. Chen read the screen 3 times to make sure she wasn't misinterpreting the data. The unknown DNA profile from the Barbara Collins case had matched a profile in the database with a probability of 1 in 800 trillion mathematical certainty that the same person who had deposited skin cells on that fiber in 2010 was now identified in the criminal justice system. The match belonged to a man named Robert Kyle Hendricks, age 47, who had been arrested in 2019 for domestic violence and subsequently entered into the database, according to Mississippi's post-conviction DNA collection laws. His address was listed as 127 Magnolia Street, Brookhaven, Mississippi, less than 2 blocks from where Barbara Collins had lived with her mother. Dr. Chen stared at the address for several long minutes, understanding that this information would shatter more than just the Collins cold case. Hendricks wasn't a stranger who had passed through Brookhaven on a summer night 13 years ago. He was a neighbor, someone who had lived in the community throughout the investigation, someone who had probably attended the vigils and search parties, expressing sympathy while hiding the terrible truth of what he had done. The phone call to Sheriff Patterson was brief and professional, but Dr. Chen could hear the sharp intake of breath when she delivered the news. After 13 years of dead ends and false leads, the Barbara Collins case had a suspect with DNA evidence linking him directly to the scene of her disappearance. "Sheriff," Dr. Chen said carefully, aware that her words would change everything for a family that had waited more than a decade for answers. "We need to talk about the Collins case, and you're going to want to sit down for this conversation." The porch light that had burned through nearly 5,000 Mississippi nights was about to fulfill its purpose in ways that transcended hope or faith or maternal determination. Science had finally caught up with evil, and the microscopic evidence that had waited patiently in storage boxes was about to illuminate the darkest corner of Brookhaven's history. Sheriff Patterson's hands shook slightly as he hung up the phone, the conversation with Dr. Chen replaying in his mind like a record stuck on repeat. After 13 years of frustration, false leads, and heartbreaking meetings with Evelyn Collins, the breakthrough had come not from witness testimony or physical evidence, but from skin cells invisible to the naked eye that had been waiting patiently in an evidence bag for technology to evolve. The name Robert Kyle Hendricks hit Patterson like a physical blow. He knew the man. Everyone in Brookhaven knew Kyle, as he preferred to be called, the friendly handyman who fixed leaky roofs and painted houses throughout the county. The guy who showed up at community barbecues with his wife and 2 kids, who coached Little League baseball and helped organize the annual Christmas toy drive. The neighbor had probably stood in Evelyn Collins' front yard, holding a candle during those early vigils, expressing sympathy while hiding the truth about what he had done. Patterson spread Kyle's file across his desk with the same careful reverence he might use handling a bomb. The domestic violence arrest from 2019 had been relatively minor, a dispute with his ex-wife that resulted in a night in jail and mandatory anger management classes. Kyle had paid his fine, completed the required counseling, and returned to his life of apparent normalcy. But the arrest had triggered Mississippi's DNA collection law, requiring a swab sample that was entered into the CUDIS database. It wasn't the drifter, Patterson muttered to himself, staring at Kyle's booking photo. It wasn't the boogeyman or some trucker passing through town. It was him, living 2 blocks away from her mother, fixing their neighbors' porches, and coaching their kids. All along it was him. The investigation that had been dormant for years suddenly erupted into controlled chaos. Detective Montgomery was called back from her vacation in Florida. The district attorney was briefed on the DNA evidence. Federal agencies that had initially provided assistance in 2010 were contacted about coordinating the arrest. But beneath the professional activity was a current of rage and betrayal that threatened to overwhelm everyone involved in the case. The DNA evidence was only the beginning. Armed with Kyle's name and address, investigators began reconstructing his activities during the critical period around Barbara's disappearance. They discovered that his work truck, a blue Ford F-150, had been seen in the Mel's Diner parking lot on multiple occasions during the weeks before Barbara vanished. Witnesses who had been interviewed in 2010 were recontacted, and several remembered seeing Kyle at the diner, always sitting alone, always watching the waitresses with what they now realized had been predatory interest. "He came in maybe twice a week," recalled Jenny Martinez, Barbara's former co-worker, her voice tight with disgust. "Always ordered the same thing, coffee and pie. He seemed nice enough, asked about our families, and tipped well. But now that I think about it, he was always there during Barbara's shifts. I thought it was coincidence, but maybe he was studying her routine." The most damning evidence came from Kyle's own property. Armed with search warrants, investigators descended on his modest house on Magnolia Street like an army of scientific archaeologists. In the backyard, partially hidden beneath an old tarp and covered with kudzu vines, they found parts of a Honda Civic that had been methodically dismantled and scattered across Kyle's 5-acre lot. The car's VIN had been ground away with professional skill, but forensic metallurgy techniques could reveal numbers that had been etched below the surface level through acid treatments and microscopic analysis. The partial VIN matched Barbara's 2004 Honda Civic perfectly, providing physical evidence that connected her disappearance directly to Kyle's property. He was smart about it, admits Detective Montgomery, who supervised the property search. The car was cut up with professional tools. The parts were scattered and hidden, and if we hadn't known exactly what to look for, we might have missed it entirely. But he couldn't eliminate every trace of what he'd done. The VIN was still there, waiting for the right technology to reveal it. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation was chilling in its ordinariness. Kyle Hendricks was a master of compartmentalization, maintaining a public persona of helpfulness and community involvement, while harboring predatory instincts that he had apparently been acting on for years. Further investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that had been invisible to casual observation, but became clear when viewed through the lens of criminal intent. Kyle had used his handyman business to gain access to homes throughout the county, particularly homes where single women lived alone. Several customers reported feeling uncomfortable around him, describing occasions when he had lingered longer than necessary, asked personal questions about their routines, or seemed to be studying their home's security features rather than focusing on the repair work he had been hired to perform. "He fixed my kitchen sink in 2009, remembers Carol Stevens, a widow who lived alone on the outskirts of Brookhaven. "He did good work, but something about him made me nervous. He kept asking when I got home from work, whether I had family who visited regularly, and stuff that seemed too personal for someone I'd just hired to fix a pipe. After he left, I changed my locks. I couldn't explain why, but something about him felt wrong." The betrayal cut deepest among Kyle's former friends and neighbors, people who had trusted him with their homes, their children, and their community activities. The cognitive dissonance of reconciling Kyle the helpful neighbor with Kyle the predator created a psychological trauma that rippled through Brookhaven like aftershocks from an earthquake. "He coached my son's baseball team," says Mark Rodriguez, shaking his head in disbelief. "My kid looked up to him and called him Coach Kyle. We had him over for barbecues and trusted him to drive our children to games. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that someone they admired is capable of something so evil?" As the evidence mounted against Kyle Hendricks, the case transformed from a cold file gathering dust into an active investigation that commanded resources from across Mississippi. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was consulted about Kyle's psychological profile. The State Attorney General's office assigned prosecutors with experience in high-profile murder cases. The media attention that had faded years earlier suddenly returned with hurricane force, bringing satellite trucks and national news cameras back to Brookhaven's quiet streets. But for Evelyn Collins, the breakthrough brought not relief, but a complex mixture of vindication, rage, and grief that defied easy categorization. The porch light that had burned for 13 years could finally be turned off, not because Barbara was coming home, but because the truth about why she never would was finally emerging from the shadows where it had hidden for so long. The arrest warrant for Robert Kyle Hendricks was signed on February 15, 2024, 13 years, 5 months, and 29 days after Barbara Collins had vanished into the Mississippi night. The charges were first-degree murder, kidnapping, and destruction of evidence, crimes that carried the possibility of life in prison or death, depending on what other evidence the investigation might uncover. The quiet community that had been haunted by questions was about to learn that sometimes the answers are more terrifying than the mysteries they replace. The morning of February 16, 2024, dawned gray and misty over Brookhaven, with fog rolling off the Pearl River like smoke from some distant fire. At 6:47 a.m., Sheriff Patterson and a team of federal marshals pulled into the driveway of 1244 Magnolia Street, their vehicles arranged with tactical precision around Kyle Hendricks's modest frame house. The arrest had been planned for early morning to minimize public spectacle, but in a town of 12,000 people, nothing involving police activity could remain secret for long. Kyle answered the door in boxer shorts and a Mississippi State t-shirt, coffee mug in his hand, looking every inch the sleepy suburban father disturbed by unexpected visitors. For a moment that stretched like eternity, he and Sheriff Patterson stared at each other across a threshold that separated the public, Kyle from the monster who had hidden behind his facade for 13 years. Kyle Hendricks, Patterson said, his voice steady despite the emotions roiling beneath the surface. You're under arrest for the murder of Barbara Collins. The coffee mug slipped from Kyle's fingers, shattering against the doorframe as his face went through a series of transformations. Surprise, calculation, and finally resignation, as if some part of him had been waiting for this moment. Since that August night, he offered no resistance as the handcuffs clicked into place, but his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging the faces of law enforcement officers who had suddenly invaded his carefully constructed world. "I want a lawyer," were the only words he spoke during the arrest, his voice barely above a whisper. The perp walk from Kyle's front door to the patrol car took less than 30 seconds, but those moments were captured by news cameras that had somehow materialized on the scene. With supernatural speed, the image of Kyle Hendricks, middle-aged, bald, wearing the same clothes that any suburban father might wear on a lazy Saturday morning, being led away in handcuffs, would be broadcast across Mississippi and beyond, transforming him from trusted neighbor into the face of evil that had haunted Brookhaven for more than a decade. Kyle's wife, Sandra, emerged from the house in a bathrobe, her face pale with shock and confusion. She had been married to Kyle for 15 years, had borne his children, had shared a bed with him every night since 2009, and claimed to have no knowledge of his involvement in Barbara's disappearance. The investigators believed her. Domestic violence experts know that abusers are often skilled at compartmentalizing their behavior, presenting one face to the world, while hiding their true nature even from those closest to them. Sandra Hendricks appeared genuinely surprised, notes Detective Montgomery, who observed the arrest. She kept asking what was happening, why they were taking her husband. Either she's an exceptional actress, or Kyle managed to hide his predatory behavior from his own family for years. Given what we know about how these perpetrators operate, the latter is more likely. The search of Kyle's property intensified after his arrest, with forensic teams methodically processing every inch of the 5-acre lot. In addition to the Honda Civic parts found in the backyard, investigators discovered a workshop in the basement that contained tools consistent with automotive dismantling. Traces of automotive paint and metal filings were collected from workbenches, along with cleaning supplies that suggested efforts to eliminate evidence. But the most chilling discovery came from Kyle's computer hard drive, where digital forensics experts found evidence of long-term surveillance activities. Deleted files recovered through advanced techniques revealed hundreds of photographs taken covertly around Brookhaven, women walking to their cars, entering and leaving businesses, and going about their daily routines while being stalked by a predator they didn't know existed. Many of the photographs were of Barbara Collins, taken during the weeks and months before her disappearance. The images showed her leaving the diner after work, stopping for gas, and walking to her car in various locations around town. The timestamps revealed a pattern of obsessive surveillance that had been going on for at least 6 months before Kyle acted on his fantasies. He had been watching her for a long time, explains FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Patricia Reeves, who was consulted on the case. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or a random encounter. Kyle Hendricks had been studying Barbara's routines, learning her schedule, and planning his attack with the methodical patience of a hunter stalking prey. The community reaction to Kyle's arrest was immediate and visceral. Within hours of the news breaking, crowds had gathered outside the Lincoln County Courthouse, some carrying signs demanding justice, others simply standing in stunned silence as they processed the revelation that one of their neighbors had been a killer hiding in plain sight. "He fixed our roof last summer," said Maria Gonzalez, standing outside the courthouse with tears streaming down her face. "My daughter helped him carry tools from his truck. We gave him lemonade and thanked him for his good work. And all that time he was the one who—" The sentence hung unfinished, because some truths are too terrible to speak aloud. Local businesses reported a surge in customers wanting to discuss the arrest, as if talking about Kyle's betrayal might somehow help process the psychological trauma of discovering that evil had been living among them undetected. The revelation was particularly devastating for parents whose children had interacted with Kyle through his coaching activities and community involvement. How do you explain to your kids that someone they trusted someone they looked up to could do something so horrible? Asked Jennifer Walsh, whose son had played on Kyle's Little League team. We teach our Adam to be afraid of strangers, but the real danger was someone who brought cookies to the team party and remembered their birthdays. The investigation continued even after Kyle's arrest, with forensic accountants examining his financial records for evidence of other crimes. They discovered that Kyle had been stealing small amounts of money and valuable items from the homes where he worked as a handyman. Not enough to trigger suspicion, but sufficient to supplement his income over the years. The pattern suggested a man who viewed other people's property and safety as resources to be exploited for his own benefit. DNA evidence from the recovered Honda parts provided additional confirmation of Kyle's involvement in Barbara's murder. Genetic material matching Kyle's profile was found on several pieces of the dismantled vehicle, including the steering wheel and door handles. Forensic analysis of the car parts also revealed traces of blood that matched Barbara's DNA profile, finally providing physical evidence of what investigators had long suspected, that Barbara Collins had been murdered, not simply disappeared. The arraignment was scheduled for the following Monday, giving the community a weekend to process the shocking revelation that had upended their sense of security and trust. Kyle was held without bail in the Lincoln County Jail, isolated from other prisoners for his own protection, after word spread through the facility about the nature of his alleged crimes. Sheriff Patterson found himself in the unusual position of having solved the case that had defined his career, but feeling no satisfaction in the accomplishment. The arrest of Kyle Hendricks answered questions that had tormented the community for 13 years, but it also raised new questions about how well any of us really know our neighbors, and how evil can masquerade as kindness for years without detection. "We got him," Patterson told the assembled media at a press conference following the arrest, "but that doesn't bring Barbara back, and it doesn't erase the pain her family has endured for all these years. Justice delayed is still justice, but it's not the same as justice served when it might have prevented other crimes." As news of the arrest spread beyond Brookhaven, reaching family members who had moved away and former residents who still carried memories of Barbara Collins and her tragic disappearance, one message was repeated over and over. Finally, after 13 years of questions, suspicions, and sleepless nights, the community that had been haunted by Barbara's absence was about to learn the full truth about what had happened to their beloved waitress on that humid August night. The porch light that Evelyn Collins had kept burning for 13 years could finally be turned off, not because Barbara was coming home, but because the monster who had stolen her from them was finally in custody, and justice was about to be served. The Lincoln County Courthouse had not seen crowds like this since the desegregation trials of the night. By 7 a.m. on the morning of Kyle Hendricks' trial, September 23, 2024, spectators were already lined up around the block, many carrying folding chairs and thermoses of coffee, prepared for a day that would finally bring resolution to a case that had haunted their community for 14 years. The Mississippi heat was already oppressive, with temperatures climbing toward the predicted high of 94 degrees, but no one complained about standing in the sun if it meant witnessing justice for Barbara Collins. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rebecca Martinez and assisted by a team of specialists from the State Attorney General's office, had spent months building a case that would rely heavily on scientific evidence rather than eyewitness testimony. The DNA analysis, automotive forensics, and digital evidence recovered from Kyle's property painted a picture of premeditated murder and calculated evidence destruction that left little room for reasonable doubt. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Martinez began in her opening statement, 14 years ago, Barbara Collins was stolen from her family and from this community by a man they trusted, a man who had insinuated himself into their lives under the guise of being a helpful neighbor. Today, science and justice will finally reveal the truth about what happened on that August night. Kyle Hendricks sat at the defense table, wearing a navy blue suit that made him look more like a banker than a killer, his expression carefully neutral as the prosecution outlined their case against him. His defense attorney, Jackson Morrison, a high-profile criminal lawyer from Jackson, who specialized in capital cases, had advised him to maintain an appearance of calm dignity throughout the proceedings. but observers noted that Kyle's hands trembled slightly whenever photos of Barbara were displayed on the courtroom screens. The prosecution's case unfolded with methodical precision over the course of 5 days. Amanda Chen took the stand to explain how touch DNA analysis had identified Kyle's genetic material on fibers collected from the crime scene, walking the jury through the scientific process in language that made complex forensic techniques accessible to laypeople. The probability that this DNA belongs to anyone other than the defendant is 1 in 800 trillion, Dr. Chen testified, her voice steady and professional. To put that in perspective, there are only about 8 billion people on Earth. This level of certainty is as close to scientific fact as we can achieve. The automotive evidence was equally damning. Forensic experts testified about the Honda Civic parts found on Kyle's property, explaining how VIN analysis had definitively linked the dismantled vehicle to Barbara's car. The systematic nature of the car's destruction, cut into pieces with professional tools, parts scattered and hidden across 5 acres, demonstrated a level of planning and calculation that contradicted any potential defense claim of accidental death or temporary insanity. The digital evidence proved most disturbing to jurors and spectators alike. FBI cybercrime specialists walked the court through Kyle's deleted files, displaying the hundreds of surveillance photographs he had taken of Barbara and other women around Brookhaven. The timestamps revealed months of stalking behavior, with Kyle documenting Barbara's routines, her work schedule, and her routes home, building toward the night when he would finally act on his fantasies. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity, explained FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Patricia Reeves during her expert testimony. Kyle Hendricks engaged in extensive pre-offense behavior consistent with organized predatory criminals. He selected his victim, studied her patterns, planned his approach, and prepared for evidence disposal, all hallmarks of a calculated killer. The defense strategy, such as it was, focused on challenging the reliability of DNA evidence and suggesting alternative explanations for Kyle's possession of car parts. Morrison argued that touch DNA could be transferred innocently, that Kyle might have unknowingly come into contact with fibers from Barbara's clothing through normal community interactions. He suggested that Kyle might have purchased the Honda parts legitimately, unaware of their connection to the Collins case. But the prosecution had anticipated these arguments, presenting evidence that Kyle had no legitimate reason to possess automotive parts from Barbara's specific vehicle, and that the pattern of his DNA deposition was consistent with direct contact during a violent struggle, rather than innocent transfer. The sheer volume of evidence, DNA, automotive forensics, digital surveillance, timeline analysis, created a web of proof that the defense could not effectively challenge. The emotional high point of the trial came when Evelyn Collins took the stand to deliver her victim impact statement. At 67, she moved slowly to the witness stand, her hair now completely gray, but her voice strong with the authority that comes from surviving unimaginable loss. For 14 years, she began, looking directly at Kyle Hendricks, I kept a light burning on my front porch. Every single night, through hurricanes and ice storms and blazing summer heat, that light stayed on because I believed my daughter might still find her way home. I know now that she never will, but I also know that the light wasn't wasted. It brought the attention that kept this case alive, kept people caring, and kept investigators working until science could finally reveal the truth. Her voice broke only once, when she described the daily ritual of setting 2 coffee cups on the kitchen table each morning, forgetting for just a moment that Barbara would never again share breakfast with her mother. The courtroom was silent except for muffled sobs from spectators who had waited years for this moment of closure. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and destruction of evidence. Kyle Hendricks showed no visible reaction as the foreman read the verdict, but several of his family members collapsed in tears, finally confronting the reality that the man they had loved was capable of unthinkable evil. The sentencing phase began immediately, with the prosecution seeking life in prison without possibility of parole. Kyle's family pleaded for mercy, describing him as a devoted father who had made a terrible mistake, but their testimony was overshadowed by evidence of his calculated planning and the devastating impact of his crimes on the entire community. Judge William Crawford, who had presided over the case with patience and dignity throughout the lengthy proceedings, delivered the sentence with solemnity appropriate to the moment. Kyle Hendricks, you have been found guilty of the premeditated murder of Barbara Collins, a young woman whose only crime was working hard to build a better life for herself. Your actions robbed not only Barbara of her future, but also her mother of a daughter, this community of a beloved member, and all of us of our sense of safety and trust. I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel's impact echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, finally bringing legal closure to a case that had tormented Brookhaven for more than a decade. Spectators erupted in applause that Judge Crawford allowed to continue for several moments before calling for order. Outside the courthouse, Evelyn Collins stood before a crowd of reporters and community members, holding a small electric candle, the same kind she had carried during those early vigils 14 years earlier. Tonight, for the first time in 14 years, I'm going to turn off the porch light, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. Not because Barbara is coming home, I know now that she never will, but because justice has been served, and her killer will never hurt another family the way he hurt ours. The light served its purpose. Barbara is finally home in our hearts, and we can begin to heal. As the crowd began to disperse, many carrying their own candles in a spontaneous memorial procession, the transformation in Brookhaven's collective spirit was palpable. The fear and suspicion that had poisoned their community for 14 years was finally lifted, replaced by a hard-won understanding that justice, however delayed, could still prevail. That evening, as darkness settled over Mississippi, the porch light at the Collins family home went dark for the first time since August, but throughout the neighborhood, other lights burned brightly, not the desperate beacon of a mother's hope, but the warm glow of a community that had faced evil and refused to surrender to it. In the quiet hours before dawn on September 24, 2024, Evelyn Collins sat on her front porch for the last time in darkness, watching the eastern sky lighten over a Brookhaven that would never be quite the same. The switch for the porch light sat unused beside her chair, a small plastic toggle that had controlled her most sacred ritual for more than 5,000 nights. The silence felt different now, not the oppressive weight of unanswered questions, but the peaceful quiet that comes after a storm has finally passed. The Barbara Collins case had ended not with the reunion that Evelyn had prayed for through all those years of waiting, but with something almost as powerful, the certainty that comes from finally knowing the truth. Kyle Hendricks would spend the rest of his life in prison, and the questions that had tormented a community for 14 years had finally been answered. Justice had been served, though it came at a price that could never be fully calculated. The revelation that evil had hidden behind Kyle's facade of neighborly helpfulness cut deeper than any random crime might have. It forced Brookhaven to confront uncomfortable truths about how little any of us really know about the people who share our communities. The helpful handyman who fixed leaky roofs and coached Little League baseball had been watching, planning and stalking victims while maintaining a perfect public persona, a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. But the case also demonstrated the power of persistence, both human and technological. Evelyn's refusal to surrender hope, symbolized by that porch light burning through 14 years of darkness, had kept Barbara's story alive long enough for science to catch up with justice. The skin cells that Kyle had unknowingly left behind in 2010 had waited patiently in evidence storage until DNA technology evolved to the point where microscopic traces could reveal their secrets. Dr. Amanda Chen, whose forensic analysis had broken the case, reflected on the intersection of old crimes and new science that was revolutionizing criminal justice across America. We're living through a golden age of cold case investigation, she explained. Evidence that was essentially meaningless 20 years ago can now provide definitive answers. Every unsolved case from the past 3 decades is potentially solvable with current technology. The implications extend far beyond Brookhaven. Across Mississippi and throughout the United States, evidence from thousands of cold cases is being re-examined using advanced DNA techniques, genetic genealogy, and computer databases that didn't exist when the crimes were originally investigated. Families who had given up hope are receiving phone calls that begin with the words every cold case family dreams of hearing. We need to talk about your case. But technology alone cannot solve crimes or heal communities. The Barbara Collins case succeeded because human determination, embodied by her mother's vigil and law enforcement's refusal to abandon the investigation, bridged the gap between the crime and its eventual solution. The porch light became more than just a symbol of hope. It was a beacon that kept Barbara's story visible until science could illuminate the truth. The psychological impact on Brookhaven will likely persist for years. Parents are more protective of their children. Women are more cautious about working alone at night, and everyone locks their doors with greater awareness of the potential for evil to hide behind familiar faces. But the community has also discovered reserves of strength and solidarity that might never have been tested without this tragedy. The annual Barbara Collins Memorial Scholarship continues to provide educational opportunities for young women throughout Lincoln County. The support group that Evelyn organized for families of missing persons has expanded to serve similar cases across Mississippi, and the investigative techniques that solved Barbara's case are being applied to other cold cases, potentially bringing closure to families who have waited decades for answers. Today, Barbara Collins is remembered not just as a victim of violent crime, but as a catalyst for advances in forensic science and community healing. Her case has been studied by law enforcement agencies throughout the South as an example of how persistence, technology, and community support can combine to achieve justice, even in the most challenging circumstances. The empty space that Barbara's death created in Brookhaven will never be filled, but it has been transformed into something meaningful, a reminder that individual lives matter, that evil actions have consequences, and that justice, however delayed, can still illuminate the darkest corners of human experience. As the sun rose over Mississippi on that September morning, Evelyn Collins finally stood up from her vigil chair and walked inside, leaving the porch light switch in the off position. The beacon that had burned for 14 years had served its purpose, guiding investigators and community members toward a truth that was both terrible and necessary. Barbara Collins was finally home, not in the way her mother had hoped, but in the way that perhaps mattered most. Her story had become a testament to the unbreakable bonds between mothers and daughters, the power of science to serve justice, and the refusal of good people to let evil triumph through silence or forgetfulness. The light that had burned for so long in the darkness had finally illuminated not just a crime but the enduring strength of a community that refused to surrender hope, even when hope seemed impossible to sustain. The porch light at 147 Magnolia Street has been dark since September 24, 2024, but across Brookhaven, other lights burn bright in the windows of families who remember Barbara Collins, in the laboratories where scientists work to solve cold cases, and in the hearts of people who understand that some lights are too important to extinguish, even after their purpose has been fulfilled.